All right, let's dive into something pretty thought-provoking today. Feminist philosophy of religion. And, as a philosopher, this isn't just some obscure academic thing. It's about using philosophy to really grapple with big questions about gender, power, and even the nature of the divine. Our main source today is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on feminist philosophy of religion.
And it's fascinating because it's not just about adding women's voices to the mix. It's potentially about changing the whole landscape of how we do philosophy.
Absolutely. It's like looking through a new lens, and suddenly all these assumptions and biases we might not have noticed before are right there in front of us. And speaking of eye-opening stuff, I found this quote by Elizabeth Cady Stanton that really hit me. Back in 1885, she wrote, "History shows that the moral degradation of woman is due more to theological superstitions than to all other influences together."
Wow, that's pretty strong. It really shows that critical edge of feminist philosophy of religion, right? She basically saying religion has been a huge part of keeping women unequal.
It's like she's pointing right at the core of religious belief and saying, this is where the problem starts. But then we have someone like Luce Irigaray, a more modern thinker, who comes at it from a totally different angle. She says, God alone can save us, keep us safe. The feeling of subjectivity is essential for us, just like a God who helps us and leads us in the path of becoming, who inspires our projects.
Yeah, Irigaray really embodies that reconstructive side of feminist philosophy of religion. She's not throwing out the idea of the divine. She's trying to reimagine it in a way that actually empowers women.
So we have this tension right away.
Mm.
Critique and reconstruction, like two sides of the same coin, dismantling what's oppressive and building something new and freeing in its place. But before we go too far, let's define things. What exactly is feminist philosophy of religion?
Well, it's a pretty new field, and it's different from feminist theology, which often works within specific religious traditions. Feminist philosophy of religion takes a wider view, using philosophy's tools and methods to examine religious beliefs, practices, and institutions.
So it's less about interpreting scripture and more about the fundamental questions, like how religious belief and gender connect, right? But why has philosophy been slower to embrace this feminist perspective compared to, say, theology or religious studies?
Well, for a long time, philosophy, especially philosophy of religion, was kind of a boys' club. The big names, the classic texts, almost all men.
Yeah, the usual suspects, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas. Not exactly a diverse group. But it's more than just who's writing the books, isn't it? There's the whole structure of academia
Right.
itself.
For sure. Philosophy departments haven't always been as open to feminist scholarship as other fields.
And there's that whole myth of the objective philosopher, right? This idea that you can be totally neutral and unbiased when, let's be real, your perspective, experiences, even your gender, shape how you approach these huge philosophical questions.
Exactly. Feminist philosophy of religion confronts that head on, saying that who we are influences how we think about these things.
So it's not just about adding women to the canon. It's about changing how we think about philosophy itself. And one place where this is super clear is in the critique of traditional philosophy of religion.
Right. Absolutely. Feminist philosophers have been showing how gender bias has shaped the very problems, the focus, even the concepts we use in traditional philosophy of religion.
It's like that line from The Matrix. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Feminist philosophy of religion is offering that red pill, showing us just how deep that gender bias goes.
Great analogy. One example is that Eurocentric Protestant bias you often see. Like they assume religion just means one very specific type of Christianity.
It's like they're in this bubble, ignoring all the other beliefs and practices out there. The Stanford Encyclopedia even uses this funny example, a character from Tom Jones who thinks religion means the Church of England. Like, seriously.
And it's not just geography, it's also overlooking feminist thought within different religious traditions. All those mystics, scholars, activists, women who've been wrestling with these questions for centuries.
And yet their voices are often missing, like they've been written out of the story.
Exactly. And then there's how traditional theism, especially in the late 20th century, just completely ignored feminist perspectives. Analytic philosophy got fixated on proving God exists, the rationality of belief, all while ignoring the gender bias baked into those very concepts.
It's like they were so busy building this perfectly logical house of cards, they didn't notice the shaky ground it was built on. And the thing is, gender bias in religion isn't some abstract problem. It has real consequences.
Yeah.
Like Elizabeth Johnson's metaphor, a buried continent.
Ooh, that's powerful. It implies that this bias is everywhere, so deep that it shapes everything. It's not just a few surface issues, it's foundational.
Like an iceberg, what we see is just the tip. We've got to dive deep to see how this buried continent has affected everything from religious texts and practices to the very concept of God. And speaking of God, that's where this bias becomes super obvious, right?
Absolutely. The problem of God, as it's called, becomes a central focus for feminist critique.
So let's talk about God then. What are some key issues feminists have raised about how we traditionally think about the divine?
Well, one big one is the overwhelming maleness of God. The Stanford Encyclopedia is very clear on this. Even when God is thought of abstractly in Western thought, the divine is still male.
So it's not just the name God or the pronouns, it's something deeper in the very concept itself. But why does this matter?
It matters because this male God has real-world effects. It reinforces patriarchy, makes male authority seem natural, and supports this idea that men are somehow closer to the divine.
It's like this male God casts this huge shadow, influencing our laws, social norms, even personal relationships. But how does this actually play out in philosophical discussions about God? Can you give some examples?
Sure. One is religious language. The constant use of male metaphors and pronouns for God reinforces this idea that the divine is masculine, like female imagery just isn't good enough for the ultimate source of being.
I've always found that so odd. Why can't God be a she or a they? Why does it have to be a he?
And then there's the attributes of God, like omnipotence. This idea of God as all-powerful often gets interpreted as domination and control, which fits perfectly with traditional masculinity.
It's like we've taken our own human ideas about power and projected them onto God, creating this divine being in our own image, a powerful, controlling male figure.
Exactly. But what if we reimagined divine power? What if it wasn't about dominance and control, but about love, compassion, or creative energy?
That's a cool thought. It's like we're opening up this whole new way of thinking about the divine.
And that's what feminist philosophy of religion is all about, challenging assumptions, questioning biases, and exploring new possibilities.
Well, my brain is already working overtime. We've only just scratched the surface. But wait, we're about to go even deeper. In part 2 of this deep dive, we'll see how feminist thinkers have gone beyond critique to offer alternative visions of the divine. Stay tuned, because it's going to get really interesting. Welcome back. That last part really got me thinking about, all that philosophical baggage we've been carrying around. But now I'm excited to see what we can build once we clear it all out.
That's the fun part. Feminist thinkers haven't just been critiquing, they've also been busy creating these new, inspiring visions of what the divine could be.
So where do we even start? Reimagining God seems like a pretty big task.
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia gives us some cool examples of feminist theological work that offer different ways of thinking about God. For instance, there's Hildegard of Bingen, that medieval mystic. She had these amazing visions of the divine as like a life-giving force, a burning fire, a guide in the fog.
Wait, hold on. A burning fire. That's not exactly what I picture when I think of God.
Right, but that's what's so cool about Hildegard's vision. She's breaking free from those traditional static images and giving us something way more dynamic, more alive.
It's like she's tapping into this different kind of religious experience, one that's rooted in the body, in nature, in that raw creative energy.
Exactly. And even back in the 12th century, her vision was surprisingly aligned with a lot of themes we see in modern feminist thought. Interconnectedness, relationships, a divine that's part of the world, not some far-off, detached being.
It's amazing how those ideas have lasted through the centuries. And then there's Rosemary Ruther, who uses this interesting term, goddess, to represent a divine that goes beyond those patriarchal limits. What's that all about?
Ruther's trying to get past that male-female binary and imagine a divine that includes both and goes beyond both. It's recognizing that we can't box in the divine with these narrow human categories.
So it's not just about swapping a male god for a female goddess.
Right.
It's something way more radical, breaking free from those binaries completely.
Exactly. And then you have Sally McFaig, who's known for using metaphors like God as mother, lover, and friend, all trying to move away from that traditional father-god image.
Okay, I get wanting to move beyond the father god.
Yeah.
But aren't we just replacing one set of metaphors with another? How do we know these new ones are any better?
That's a great question, and it's one that feminist philosophers are wrestling with. While metaphors can be powerful, they can also be limiting. So how do we turn these poetic visions into more rigorous philosophical concepts? How do we go beyond metaphor and actually develop a solid feminist philosophy of God?
I'm ready. Tell me more.
All right, well, the Stanford Encyclopedia suggests two main schools of thought that offer ways to do this: the classical ontology of being and the ontology of becoming.
Okay, those sound like some pretty heavy philosophical terms. Can you break those down for us?
Sure, the classical ontology of being, think Aquinas and Tillich, sees God as esse ipsum, being itself. It's the ultimate source, the ground of all existence.
So God isn't just one being among many. It's like the very foundation of being itself, like the canvas the whole universe is painted on.
Exactly. And this tradition actually gives us some interesting tools for feminist philosophy of religion. For example, if God is being itself, then it can't be limited by any specific gender or form.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like saying the very essence of existence is beyond those human categories of male and female.
Exactly. But then there's the ontology of becoming, with thinkers like Whitehead, Hartshorne, and Cobb. This view focuses on process, relationships, and the interconnectedness of everything.
Okay, so instead of a fixed, unchanging God, we have a God who's always changing, always evolving, and interacting with the world.
Right. And this process-oriented view fits well with a lot of feminist ideas, like the emphasis on interconnectedness, interdependence, and rejecting those rigid hierarchies.
I can see how that would appeal to feminists. It's like moving from a top-down model, where God is this all-powerful ruler, to a more horizontal model, where everything's interconnected and depends on each other.
Exactly. And it opens up new ways to think about divine power, not as dominance and control, but as that creative energy driving the constant process of becoming.
It's like we're shifting from a God who dictates from above to one who's participating in this messy, beautiful dance of creation. I like it.
Me too. And the Stanford Encyclopedia even suggests we could combine these two traditions. Imagine a divine that's both the dynamic ground of all being and the creative force pushing the universe forward, a God who's both being and becoming.
No, that's a mind-blowing idea. It's like we're taking the best parts of both and weaving them together into this rich, complex understanding of the divine.
And I think that's what makes feminist philosophy of religion so exciting. It's not about finding simple answers or settling for easy solutions. It's about embracing the complexity, the nuances, the constant process of questioning and reimagining.
It's like we're on this intellectual adventure exploring uncharted territory. Who knows what amazing discoveries we'll make along the way? But hold on a second. I know we've been focused on the problem of God, but the Stanford Encyclopedia also mentions some other interesting approaches to feminist philosophy of religion. Approaches that go beyond just the God question.
That's right. Some feminist philosophers are moving past the God question and focusing on other issues like feminist epistemology, the role of language and discourse, and how important embodiment is.
Okay, those are some pretty big topics. But before we get into those, let's take a quick breather and regroup. We'll be back in a jiffy with part 3 of our deep dive into feminist philosophy of religion. All right, we're back. Ready to jump into this final part of our deep dive into feminist philosophy of religion. We've talked about the problem of God, looked at different ways to see the divine, and even tackled some tough philosophical concepts like ontology and becoming.
Right. And now we're shifting gears a bit. We're going to look at how feminist philosophers use different tools like language and discourse to analyze religion. We're talking about how power dynamics shape how we see the world.
That sounds interesting, but also a little intimidating. Could you give us a guide for this new territory?
Sure. The Stanford Encyclopedia talks about the work of Mary McClintock Fulkerson. She's a scholar who uses a post-structuralist approach to look at how language, experience, and power are all connected.
Hold on for a second. Can we break down that term, post-structuralist? It sounds pretty academic.
Of course. Simply put, post-structuralism challenges the idea that language just reflects reality. Instead, it says that language actually shapes how we understand the world. It creates meaning and categories that influence how we see things.
So it's not just words mirroring reality, but words actually creating reality.
Exactly. And Fulkerson uses this post-structuralist lens to study religion. She shows how language shapes our understanding of gender and religious experience.
That makes sense. We've already seen how traditional religious language, with all that male imagery, can reinforce those patriarchal ideas about God.
Right. But Fulkerson digs even deeper. She challenges some basic assumptions in feminist thought. For instance, she critiques the idea that there's one single women's experience we can neatly define.
Yeah, I always thought that was a bit oversimplified, trying to fit all the different lives of women into one little box.
Exactly. Fulkerson says we need to move past this women's experience idea and see that women have multiple positions and that language and power affect their lives in complex ways.
So instead of asking, what is women's experience? We should be asking, how are different women's positions created and negotiated within specific social and religious contexts.
Exactly. And Fulkerson shows this through her analysis of two very different groups of women, Appalachian Pentecostal women preachers and Presbyterian women's groups. She shows how both groups navigate religious traditions in ways that are both liberating and constraining.
That's fascinating. It reminds us that even within these seemingly patriarchal religious systems, there are still spaces for agency, resistance, and finding your own meaning.
Exactly. Fulkerson's work highlights how important it is to understand religion not as just a set of beliefs, but as a lived experience, an experience shaped by language, power, and our social contexts.
It's about moving past those abstract theological debates and looking at how people actually live and experience their faith.
Precisely. And this brings us to another key point. Fulkerson, like a lot of post-structuralist thinkers, doesn't believe there's one neutral, objective way to judge if religious claims are true or false.
So it's not about proving or disproving religious beliefs. It's more about understanding how those beliefs work within specific communities and how they impact people's lives.
Exactly. She focuses on those practices of resistance, survival, love, and hope that come from women's engagement with religion.
It's about seeing how faith can shape lives, create meaning, and inspire action, even within systems that might seem oppressive. That's a really powerful idea.
It is. And it brings us to this last point in the Stanford Encyclopedia: the connection between pragmatism and feminism in North American philosophy of religion.
Right. They mentioned Charlene Haddock Siegfried as a key person in this movement. What are some of the things pragmatism and feminism have in common?
Both traditions are skeptical of this idea that there's only one right way to know the world. They reject those rigid divisions between facts and values, and they emphasize lived experience and the link between theory and practice.
So it's about seeing knowledge as something that comes from our experiences in the world, our relationships, rather than some set of eternal truths.
Exactly. And this pragmatic, feminist way of thinking has opened up new ways to explore religious questions. It's about moving past those old philosophical frameworks and engaging with religion as this dynamic, lived experience.
Wow, this deep dive has been incredible. We've covered so much dissecting traditional theism, exploring new ways of seeing the divine, analyzing language and power, and understanding the complexity of how people actually live their faith.
It's been a whirlwind tour of feminist philosophy of religion. We've only scratched the surface, but I think we've highlighted some of the most important insights and challenges this field offers.
I'm left with a sense of both how limited traditional approaches to religion are and the incredible possibilities that come when we look at these questions through a feminist lens. It's like a whole new world of philosophical inquiry has opened up.
And that's the beauty of feminist philosophy of religion. It doesn't give easy answers, but it invites us to think differently, challenge what we assume, and imagine new, more liberating ways of understanding the divine, ourselves, and the world around us.
So to our listener, the philosopher who's been on this journey with us, we leave you with this. Given the limitations of both traditional theism and those purely gynocentric approaches, what might a truly inclusive and freeing philosophy of religion look like? What new ideas, metaphors, and practices could we create to build a more just and equal religious landscape?
Those are important questions to think about, and we encourage you to keep exploring them even after this deep dive is over.
Thank you for joining us on this intellectual adventure. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.